All right, well, welcome everybody. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us today. I'm Erik Paulsen, the chairman of the Institute for Gene Therapies, or IGT. Hopefully, by now, most of you are familiar with our work to help patients realize the promise of gene therapies. We are excited, though, to host today's discussion alongside the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, or ARM, as we all look ahead to the new year and an important future in the gene therapy space. Because today, gene therapies are advancing through the approval process to help many patient communities. This year, we have already seen the approval. I think I'm hitting those buttons by accident. We've already seen the approval this year of the first gene therapy to treat Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and the FDA, of course, just approved 2 new sickle cell gene therapies just last week. So it's a very exciting time for patients, for their families, and all of us who are here today. Today, you're going to hear more about what gene therapies mean to patient communities, their very unique value, and some of the policy opportunities and the challenges, of course, that we face and we will face next year. So first, we'll hear from a variety of folks here today, but I do want to welcome to the podium and introduce Lauren Holder. Lauren is a member of IGT's Patient Advocacy Advisory Council. She is a Huntington disease patient advocate. She's a caregiver, and she's also the host and founder of the Help 4HD Live podcast. So Lauren is going to be sharing more about her personal story, what gene therapy means to the Huntington's community as well as to the rare disease community, and why it's important to modernize our policies to making sure that we are helping deliver gene therapies to patients. So, Lauren, if you'd like to just come forward.
Hi guys, just bear with me a little bit. It's been a while since I've spoken, at least in person. I want to thank IGT for inviting me to be here today, and I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your day to come and listen. As Erik said, my name is Lauren Holder, and I have Huntington's disease, or as you'll hear me call it, HD. HD is a rare genetic neurologic disease that is similar to ALS and Parkinson's. Like ALS, HD is a progressive neurodegenerative disease, which is a fancy way of saying that it gets worse over time. There's no cure for HD, and currently there are no approved treatments for the underlying cause of HD. One of the biggest differences between HD and other neurologic diseases like ALS or Parkinson's is that it is 100% genetic. If you test positive for the genetic mutation, you will develop the disease at some point. There's also a 50-50 chance of passing the genetic mutation on to your children. HD used to be called Huntington's chorea because one of the hallmark symptoms of it are these involuntary muscle movements that can happen anywhere in a person's body, and when mixed with other symptoms of HD like delayed speech or slurred speech, often give the appearance of the person being drunk. However, there's a lot more to HD than movements. HD also affects a person's mood or behavior as well as a person's cognitive function. In fact, because of research, we now know that the behavioral and cognitive symptoms of HD show up years before the movements, and these early symptoms often lead to issues in the workplace and eventually disability. The only way to treat the underlying cause of HD is by using gene therapies and/or gene-modifying drugs, and we are closer than ever to that being a reality. Other neurodegenerative diseases like ALS have set a precedent with the approval of gene therapies to treat the underlying cause of the disease. However, now the question is, how do we afford it? The average age of onset in HD is the prime working years, ages 30 to 50. Most families affected by HD are financially struggling because of that and because of a lack of resources. Many people with HD who are applying for disability benefits must go on Medicaid as they wait 2 years from disability approval to be eligible for Medicare. I'm going to see if I can go back here on the slides, maybe. Yeah. So this is my dad and me. I found out that HD ran in my family when I was 15 years old after the VA tested my grandfather for it because of his weird movements and behavior. I've always loved to research things, so of course the first thing I did was try to find out as much information as I could about it. I even wrote my senior thesis about it. I remember being terrified that I was going to get it after reading about the 50-50 chance of passing it on. That fear increased when my laid-back, fun-loving, hard-working dad started having behavioral changes. I got married young at the age of 19, and my new husband and I moved to Connecticut, where he was stationed for shore duty in the Navy. At the age of 20, I decided to undergo genetic testing to see if I had HD. Although I was consistently told that there was no reason for me to test because HD is a death sentence and there was nothing for me, I was determined to do it because I wanted to be proactive. So at the age of 20, I tested positive for HD. This also meant that my dad 100% had HD. Receiving a genetic result like that is terrifying. As I mentioned before, I love to research, so that's what I did. I eventually found my tribe in the HD community. I coped by getting involved as much as I could. I started doing fundraisers. I started attending educational events. And as I would get angry about the lack of resources or knowledge in regard to HD, I would let that anger fuel me and turn it into a passion. I began doing law enforcement education. I would travel to DC to advocate for the HD Parity Act and a better quality of life for people with HD. I would go talk to medical students, and I participated in observational studies. I became the HDSA chapter president in North Carolina and then eventually joined the HDSA National Field Committee. In 2014, I won the HDSA Person of the Year award for my many efforts, which was a huge moment for me. But in 2015, my life completely changed. While I was doing all these things, my dad was gradually getting worse. My dad was officially diagnosed with HD in 2009 while living in Florida. We dealt with so many issues when it came to getting the medications he needed, because after being approved for disability benefits, there's a 2-year waiting period to receive Medicare. The hope is that you will qualify for Medicaid during those 2 years, but we learned quickly that Medicaid benefits and resources differ from state to state. While some states like California have a very good Medicaid program, other states like North Carolina and Florida are lacking when it comes to Medicaid and other available resources, which make it very difficult for people with HD and their families. As his disease progressed, we had to eventually move him and my mom back to North Carolina, where my husband and I were living, so we could help take care of him. In 2015, he had to undergo an extensive surgery that was not related to HD, but which caused his HD to progress. My dad loved computers. He used to get on the computer and use a flight simulator to fly wherever it was that he wanted to go, all the places he wanted to visit. He loved people and music, concerts, and he was a major foodie. At this point, though, he couldn't navigate the computer. He was having a hard time even using a remote control for the TV. He needed help with bathing and dressing. I stopped everything I was doing in the HD community to become his caregiver. In 2016, my mother, who had been the primary caregiver up until then, had a heart attack and needed quadruple bypass surgery. And from that point on, I took on the role of the primary caregiver. When COVID hit in 2020, I was trying to balance having a full-time job at the hospital and caregiving, as well as taking care of my 2 young kids. After my dad had a bad fall and hurt his ribs in early 2020, I ended up moving my parents even closer to me and switching to the night shift at the hospital. My dad rapidly declined that year. I didn't want to put him into a skilled nursing facility because I knew that it could be my last year with him. We dealt with multiple hospitalizations due to falls and aspiration pneumonia, greater than 6 hospitalizations. We could barely get at-home resources like a CNA to come in and help us because the healthcare system was so strapped from COVID. My husband and I eventually ended up finding an old hospital ICU bed in a warehouse about an hour from us, and my husband cleaned it up and we put it in my parents' apartment. My mother and I took care of my dad at home pretty much by ourselves until he passed away in January of 2021. This was one of the worst times in my life. No one talks about the different types of grief and loss there are. There's the grief of losing your loved one and this loss of identity when you're a caregiver. But there's also this anticipatory grief of seeing your potential future if no cure or treatment is found. Along with that comes this sense of urgency for research to move faster because time is running out. That sense of urgency is more real to me today than ever. That's because in 2022, after I was terminated from a job I loved because of work performance issues, I had neurocognitive testing done to compare to baseline testing I had done at the age of 29. While I scored high genius still in some areas, they also found a significant decline in my cognitive function, especially executive function, which is known to be one of the first areas affected by HD. And at the age of 37, I was diagnosed with neurocognitive disorder related to HD. Now, the only upside to this is that now I'm able to participate in some clinical trials. And what we do know is that gene therapies are absolutely a part of our future, as they will take those of us from dying from this devastating disease to hopefully living with it and providing a quality of life we currently do not have. So our next question remains, though, how do we afford it? Thanks.
Lauren, thank you very much for sharing that perspective. I think as you could hear from Lauren, the patient voice is so important and should be at the center of everything that we do. We appreciate you to take time to telling your story, both as a patient and as a caregiver, and a story of both challenge and hope there at the same time. So as Lauren had mentioned, there are significant challenges and questions about access to gene therapies. There's no doubt that gene therapies present very unique challenges in valuation and in reimbursement. As many of you know, federal law requires FDA-approved drugs subject to a rebate agreement be covered by each state Medicaid program upon availability. And Medicaid is absolutely a very important payer for cell and gene therapies, including many approved therapies that treat rare diseases affecting children and the new sickle cell approvals that just came out recently, as well as other severe conditions on the horizon. ARM, which we'll hear from next, has worked recently with ADVI Health to review Medicaid access barriers and conducted interviews with member organizations that have currently marketed products to assess the state Medicaid cell and gene therapy landscape. To talk more about those findings, we look forward now to hearing from Erika Cischke, the Vice President of Government Affairs at ARM. So, welcome, Erika.
Thank you, Erik, and thank you, Lauren, for being here and for telling your story. As Erik said, and as we all appreciate, the patient voice is so critical in this debate. And as you so eloquently put, the good news is that there's a lot of hope on the horizon, and the pipeline for cell and gene therapies is accelerating. So it took more than 5 years for the first 5 gene therapies to be approved, and we're on track to have 5 approvals this year alone. And there are many more in the near-term pipeline, which is very exciting. But as you alluded to, FDA approval is really just sort of the first big step in access. We need to make sure that patients can actually access those therapies. And as Erik said, Medicaid is a critical player because so many patients with rare diseases are disabled, they are lower income, or because of their disability become lower income and eligible. It's a critical payer. And just to give you some examples, so we just had the 2 first gene therapies for sickle cell approved last week. 50% of all patients with sickle cell have their first hospitalization covered by Medicaid. More than half of all children with SMA are covered under Medicaid, and about 30% of all patients with hemophilia are covered by Medicaid. So these conditions, they're really reliant on Medicaid. And the other reality is if we're serious about tackling health equity, which has become sort of a buzzword, if we're really going to get serious about improving health disparities, we have to make sure that Medicaid patients have timely and equitable access to these innovations. It shouldn't matter where you get your coverage. It shouldn't matter who's paying for it. You need to have access to these therapies. And so what ARM aimed to do is we knew anecdotally that there were concerns, some of the things that Lauren alluded to. You know, Medicaid, there are 54 Medicaid programs in our country, so you've seen one. That's what people always say about Medicaid. And the coverage varies and the payment varies. And we knew that there were different challenges, and we really wanted to seek to get a little more granular detail about this. And so we spoke with companies that had gene therapies currently on the market, most of these recently approved, and we wanted to talk about what's it actually like and what's been your experience. And so this was to augment findings that some of the patient advocacy organizations had done and some of our clinicians had done. So we interviewed these companies. These are blinded interviews, but we talked to them. And we wanted to talk to them about their experience working with Medicaid pharmaceutical and therapeutics boards, with drug utilization review process. We wanted to talk to them about what it was actually like to meet with the Medicaid staff. And we wanted to talk about how the things like price, evidence, Medicare and commercial coverage, and clinical factors sort of related to these coverage barriers. And we also wanted to learn more about how some of these other coverage influencers, if you will, ICER, value-based arrangements factored in. So there were 5 CAR Ts and 3 gene therapies that we looked at. And one of the first challenges, and this is going to be very evident as we see the rollout of the newly approved sickle cell gene therapies, is this sort of wonky issue of cross-border credentialing. But put a more simple way, patients, particularly Medicaid patients, have to cross state lines. These are rare diseases. These gene therapies are new. There's a limited number of treatment centers and centers of excellence. And that's just the reality of where the specialized providers are, often where the clinical trials were hosted. And so there's not going to be one in every state. And these patients are spread throughout. So in the case of sickle cell, you see a preponderance of patients located in the southeastern United States. Unfortunately, there aren't any treatment centers. I think there's one in Tennessee, there's some in Texas, but there aren't any in the southeastern United States. So these patients have to travel across state lines. And putting aside for a moment the fact that it's costly and difficult to travel across state lines, and that's something I think John may talk a little bit more about, but there's also some administrative barriers that we can really start to tackle. And one of the key issues is that a physician who's caring for a patient from out of state, in order to be paid by the state's Medicaid agency, they have to enroll with the other state, the patient's home state. So they first have to enroll and become credentialed just so they can be reimbursed. And then, as Lauren alluded to, there's disparities in how much the Medicaid programs reimburse. So some states are upwards of 60 to 70% of Medicare, and some states are as low as 30% of Medicare. And so that also creates the potential for inequities. If you're a center of excellence who's sort of triaging patients, it's going to be harder for you to take on more Medicaid patients. As I started to allude to, inadequate reimbursement is a big problem. So while there are coverage challenges, we find that there are really more of coverage delays. As Erik said, basically the states are legally obligated to cover these therapies, but what happens is the process by which they cover them really tends to be delayed. And let me start by saying, and I came from the Medicaid space. I worked with the Medicaid program at CMS. I've worked with many Medicaid directors, red states, blue states. These Medicaid folks, they want to help patients. They don't want to keep patients from receiving life-saving and life-altering therapies. But they're trying to manage a huge program. They're trying to manage their budgets. And so what we see is oftentimes a delay. And in the case of patients with degenerative conditions, it can be the matter of life and death. It can be a matter of whether or not they're able and clinically indicated to receive a treatment. Or it can mean a significant difference in their functional ability or their cognitive decline. And so what we've seen is that a number of states don't actually have guidelines for how quickly their Medicaid systems have to actually be updated to price and pay for these therapies. And sometimes states don't even start to figure out their coverage policies until after FDA approval, and in some instances, until they actually have a patient in their state on the Medicaid program who presents and attempts to access the therapy. And we've heard a lot of frustration from biotechnology companies who are approaching their FDA approval date, and they're trying to go out and they're trying to meet with the state Medicaid agency and let's talk to you, what information do you need? And they're just not willing to meet. And I think sometimes it's a resource problem, but this is a consistently cited challenge. And so kind of building on that, we also see, and Florida is in here, and I don't want to pick on Florida, but Lauren, you picked on Florida. So I'm just piggybacking off what you said. But a lot of states don't have these formal coverage policies for cell and gene therapy because right now they're primarily for rare disease indications. And they may not be enough patients that they need to have a formal coverage policy. And so they wait until the drug launches, and that can delay access while the state's trying to adjudicate coverage. And they also oftentimes don't have experience. These products are new. Most of the gene therapies are new. The first gene therapy was approved in 2017, and most of them have been approved in the last 3 years. And so they don't necessarily have the clinical or the scientific research or expertise. And we see a big disparity in how sophisticated states are. So we see states like Massachusetts where There's a disproportionate number of centers of excellence. There's biotech companies. They have deep expertise. And then we see smaller state Medicaid agencies that simply don't have the resources or the experts to even adjudicate these things. And so that really leads to further delays, which is further harming patients. And then another finding, and something that ARM and IGT both work together on, is, as Lauren said, how do we afford this? Another challenge that we're seeing is, again, as states are crafting their coverage policies, they're not always adhering to what FDA has ultimately decided is the appropriate indication for the therapy. And so, for example, some states may decide to, after a product is approved, choose to cover it for a more limited universe of patients. So perhaps they'll limit it to only those patients that were part of the clinical trial. And there have been lawsuits happening at the state level around this, but this is a challenge. And we also see this coming into play when they're deciding on their prior authorizations or their utilization review. And so there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between it's FDA's job to determine the safety and efficacy of these products, and they work very hard with the biotechnology companies and with the clinicians to determine the appropriate label indication, and yet some states are trying to sort of impose their own ex parte review on the process. And so here's a little chart that just shows you for the 3 CAR-Ts how it is that states have actually varied what they cover versus the label. And so you can see that for some of these products, the coverage is more restrictive than what the FDA ultimately approves. So again, that means patients have limited access. And then finally, and I'm going to turn it to John at IGT to get a little more specific about this, but there are some things that we believe can happen at the federal level that would really help. The first one gets at that delayed to coverage. So we really want to achieve shorter, streamlined drug coverage review processes. It shouldn't be the case that a product is FDA approved and that's the starting point for states to work with developers in order to establish coverage policies, because we know that's going to lead to delays. And in our interviews, we learned of a story where one patient waited 2 years from when the product was approved until they were able to be approved to be covered and receive the gene therapy. And in some patients, they don't have 2 years. They may age out of the ability to receive the treatment. They may have significantly worse health outcomes, or they may not live that long. And so we hope that CMS can work with, or Congress can work with CMS to help encourage, incentivize, require them to make these timely determinations. And again, that can be incentives, it could be requirements. And then the out-of-state coverage piece, as I alluded to, is a big issue. It's a known barrier, and it's something we can solve. But it's challenging, and we're urging Congress to work with CMS to try to establish a unified provider credentialing standard. And you know what the nice thing about this one is it doesn't actually cost a lot of money. I know it's not common that we come here and ask you for things that don't cost a lot of money, but this one doesn't. And so I think that's a great segue, and I'm going to turn it back to Erik.
Thanks, Erica. Those were incredibly valuable insights, and especially as we're preparing, as you mentioned, for so many more cell and gene therapy approvals that are coming online in the future. There's a lot that can be done to help clear a pathway for these therapies to ultimately help patients, and I know that IGT continues to advocate for proposals that will be supporting delivery to patients. We also face some challenges, as some current proposals could actually undercut some of the progress that we're making on gene therapies and the policy work that is being done right now to support the ultimate delivery to patients who need them. So here to highlight some of IGT's policy priorities and how we can better serve patients is John Feore, who is our Director of Policy at IGT. Thanks, John.
Good. Thank you, everyone. So before going into some of the specifics on policy issues, and I know that we're waiting on someone else to arrive that can get into some real specifics because he's been drafting legislation in this regard, I think it's important to talk about what we call the value of gene therapies, or the value narrative. And so when we are looking at these potential transformative, durable, life-changing therapies that are coming on the market, that have come on the market in the last couple days, we're required to make sure that access is guaranteed for all the patients, regardless of whether it's a Medicaid, Medicare patient, private payer, self-insured. Whatever the case is, there's all different payer coverage policies, obstacles in some cases, but what we're trying to help change the narrative is that the value that gene therapies can offer, not just to families and caregivers, but to the healthcare system as a whole. So generally, when Medicare or Medicaid look at a reimbursement or treating a chronic condition, they're looking at monthly costs, weekly costs. You're taking a pill daily, you're getting an injection every couple months. What we're talking about with gene therapies is potentially one-time infusion, generally at this point, of the therapy. There are a lot of healthcare services and prep, if you will, that are required with these therapies, and we're changing the genetic defect in these cases. But what we're trying to do is prevent a situation where a payer looks at something and they're focused on this one-time cost. Yes, the costs are high, and there are a lot of reasons for that, and I can't really get into the scientific manufacturing complexities of these, but we have done briefings in this regard. We believe that gene therapies will be cost-effective on a just direct and indirect medical cost basis, perhaps not over 1 year, but over several years, over a decade, over a lifetime of a patient. So there is the value if you're just going to look at a dollar basis on the healthcare system. But there are so many other elements of value that are vital to a consideration. And what we're concerned about is that payers and others may look at certain value assessment frameworks, metrics that we believe can be discriminatory, short-sighted, and would prevent not just coverage of the current gene therapies or next year's gene therapies, but for gene therapy 2.0 and 3.0. In a lot of cases, we're talking about treating and potentially curing a rare or ultra-rare genetic condition. What we learn from the innovation of gene therapies today and tomorrow could be cures and better treatments for chronic conditions, going beyond rare and ultra-rare diseases. We could literally be looking at a game-changing system, not just GLP-1s for obesity. So when we look at the value of gene therapies, there's the value of preserving the innovative nature of what these manufacturers and their researchers are doing. There's the value of hope for patients, families, and caregivers. Lauren, it just epitomizes the value of hope, that hopefully we will have a gene therapy for Huntington's disease soon that she will be able to get. And future gene therapies, diseases, the alike. There are treatment factors. So many rare diseases right now, I think it's 95%, do not even have an FDA-approved treatment. We're trying to change that. That's a pretty terrible number. So not only do they not have a treatment, that means the healthcare services that those patients are receiving are inadequate. They might actually be painful. They might actually be harmful. They're probably poisoning themselves in some cases, depending on what treatments they're receiving. So we're really trying to change this paradigm here. And so what we're hoping is that as these gene therapies get approved, stakeholders, media, members of Congress, Hill staff, policymakers at HHS, CMS, and in the states recognize the value of what they offer to patients, to caregivers, society, everyone involved. So going back to some of the policy proposals, we've been encouraged that the Medicaid program, so CMS on the Medicaid side, had implemented a couple years ago multiple best prices rule, essentially permitting manufacturers and states to enter into value-based contracts, value-based payment arrangements. There's a lot of terms that can be interchanged here. We're all still trying to figure out the best lingo. But basically allowing manufacturers to reach an agreement with a state that would ensure greater access. These arrangements would also ensure states have some budget certainty as more of these are approved, so that if there was a failure of a treatment or a patient didn't respond the way that we would hope, that the state would not be on the hook here for the full cost of the therapy. I mean, I think with last week's approval of 2 gene therapies, that probably represented 25% of the approved gene therapies have been approved in the last 4 days. So we're really in the early stages. What we want to do is make sure that policies don't inhibit access. So we want to make sure that once these gene therapies are approved that will hit the Medicare population, that the Medicare program itself doesn't impede access by fiddling around with reimbursement or coverage. We saw that with Alzheimer's. An FDA approval then led to a coverage restriction, a pretty severe coverage restriction. The FDA's job is to approve the safety and efficacy of drugs. CMS's job is not to do that. So what we're hoping is that as CMS moves forward, as Medicare moves forward, that we are focused on the ultimate outcome here, which is access to gene therapies, transforming the healthcare of patients faced with genetic diseases, genetic conditions that may be treated, cured. We're in the early stages. We don't know how durable these are. Early indications are that they are very durable, from the first gene therapies to some of the ones that have now been approved, and we have more than 6 days of experience because of the lengthy clinical trial process. All positive. But there are going to be fits and starts, as we've seen. And what we're trying to ensure, we're trying to work with our patient groups, with organizations like IGT and ARM, our manufacturer partners, our scientific and academic researchers, is to make sure that the research continues, that innovation is preserved for the future therapies. I'm happy to open it up to questions while we wait for our guest, if we want to go ahead and do that. While folks maybe thinking of some questions, I'll just highlight specifically two, I guess, a piece of legislation and a piece of regulation. So the MVP Act that has been introduced for the last 2 Congresses would formalize the regulatory multiple best prices program that would enable greater access to value-based payment arrangements in the Medicaid program. The MVP Act would ensure that this remains in the regulatory regime so that a future administration, whatever the case may be, might not pull it back before it gets up and running. And separately, while we've seen these positive developments forward with CMMI's interest in facilitating value-based payment arrangements for the Medicaid population, some potential interest out of the Medicare program in how the inpatient payment system can address lower volume, higher cost procedures, we are concerned that a Medicaid proposed rule, an MDRP rule that was proposed, I guess, in July, would throw up an obstacle and would impede the progress that we're starting to see at the federal level, in essentially a name and shame of gene therapy cost, and try to impose some IRA type of public disclosure of things that are most likely proprietary.
Just so everyone knows, a lot of the policy principles that John had referenced are on the table on the handouts over there, so grab that on your way out, or of course you can go on the website for IGT, which is gene-therapies.org. And as John had mentioned, fortunately, some in Congress are working on this issue, legislatively in particular. And so Congressman Guthrie, Congressman Anna Eshoo have reintroduced their bipartisan legislation, the Medicaid VBPs for Patients Act, or MVP Act, that John had referenced, just this year, to help position those value-based purchasing agreements and approaches as one solution that will be able to help patients. So with us today, we have Brian Fahey, who has just arrived from Congressman Guthrie's office and who has been working to build that bipartisan support right here in Congress and draft this important legislation. So I'll just give you the floor, Brian, if you want to let us know where we're at on this and how it will help create some greater access for patients. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
How's everyone doing? I'll try to be as brief as I can, understanding that we're bumping up against 4 p.m. and it's probably been a long day for a lot of people here. But this is an issue that's really important to Congressman Guthrie, and I think is kind of hopefully one of the transformative policies that Congress could pass. I mean, it's not one that you're going to hear a whole lot about. It's certainly not impeachment and certainly not, foreign aid funding, but personally, and I think Congressman Guthrie feels the same way, as does Ms. Eshoo and other members of the committee that are supportive of the bill. This is sort of shepherding in, hopefully, the age of personalized medicine. We hear about it all the time. We have gene therapies that can help cure cancer, or at least are in the pipeline, pancreatic cancer, and if you talk to some of the pharmaceutical manufacturers and you say, what's the biggest issue that you all face? I mean, what's the kind of so you get FDA approval, and then what? What's the biggest problem that you face or challenge? And market access teams are worried about Medicaid coverage. Market access teams are worried about coverage in the commercial markets. So although our bill doesn't touch the commercial markets, our bill certainly does try to address some of the challenges with state Medicaid programs. there's kind of a patchwork, and I know many of you all are experts in regulatory experts and experts in Medicaid policy, so forgive me if I'm repeating information that you already know, and please correct me if I'm slightly off. But there's kind of a patchwork of state policies. I want to say not laws, but in some states laws, but in most states, regulatory pathways to provide or to lay the foundations for value-based contracting and other flexible models to pay for high-cost cell and gene therapies. At the federal level, there's a rule that's on the books. It's a Trump era and something that President Biden has continued. We're very grateful for that. That would allow manufacturers to submit multiple best prices for the purposes of determining best price for the Medicaid drug rebate program. The idea being, if you want to, if your drug is $3.5 million and the Medicaid drug rebate program, the rebate itself is, doesn't give you enough of an incentive to sell a drug to a state Medicaid plan, you can submit a higher price. But you're sort of banking, you're kind of, you're taking a risk on your product, in which case, if it's $3.5 million, you sell the drug to a Medicaid program. I'm just making these numbers up. So, but if you sell a drug for $3 million to a state Medicaid program, you can engage in some sort of or participate in some sort of model where, a state Medicaid program director may say, okay, but here's the benchmark that you have to meet. The patient has to respond. This is X amount of hospitalizations for a sickle cell patient. It's X amount of doctor's visits. And so you have these kind of milestones along the way that if you're a manufacturer that you would have to meet. And if you're not, in that specific patient, because again, this is customized, this is personalized medicine, it's specific to each patient. If the patient isn't meeting those milestones or that, not responding to the therapy, then the state could get reimbursed for, the money that the investment that they've made up front. And that's what our bill would do. It would permanently codify the ability for these states to engage in value-based contracting with pharmaceutical manufacturers, and hopefully, lay the foundation for, or develop the blueprint for these contracts to take off in the commercial markets. That's kind of that's the short summary of what I found to be a fairly complex issue and system. Where we are legislatively, thanks to the help of many of the people in this room and advocates, we've got about 25 co-sponsors in the bill. We have about 8 Republicans, most of which are on the E&C committee. And we have about 17 Democrats right now, which is big. The bill has already been marked up out of the Energy and Commerce Committee. We're working on getting a Senate companion. So if any of you have contacts over in the Senate or you work in the Senate, please contact Mr. Mullen's office and let them know that you're interested in working with him with his office on this concept. So I think this is sort of this is a great alternative. We view this as a great alternative to some of the broader drug pricing conversations that are taking place. You're paying for what works, and you're not paying for something if it doesn't work. Versus just sort of taking a blunt instrument to something that could be really transformative and saying, well, it's too expensive, so we're just not going to pay for it, or you're going to have to pay us this price. We view that as something that's going to disincentivize really critical research and development. I'll stop there. That was kind of a lot in hopefully 5 minutes. I don't know if anyone has questions about the specifics of the bill or what we're, at least the legislative outlook and what we're thinking as far as next steps. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah.
All right. Brian, we really appreciate you and your team's leadership on this legislation, and we do hope to see the next step if you've passed out a committee, and hopefully it'll move on to the floor as you work on getting Senate companions, which is really important. So, and I'm sure anyone can follow up with you personally. You'd be open to that if you have additional questions. So, and we'll also have a few documents available on MVP Act on the table too, or of course on our website at gene-therapies.org. So, just to wrap up, I do want to thank everyone for joining us today. Please know that each of our speakers will be available for some private questions which you may have, and we look forward to working with all of you in the future, and have a great evening and a great holiday season. Thanks for coming.